Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Cornerstones. Thanks for being here tonight. We're delighted to have Ron Bottrell as our speaker, and I also want to mention that his wife, Polly Peters Bottrell, is here with him, and both Ron and Polly are very active in Fourth Church, and Polly is co-chair of the Adult Education Council. So if you want to chat with her about that, I just wanted to mention that. So we're delighted to have, I don't have my glasses on, but we're delighted to welcome Ron as our speaker. Ron is a member of the Presbyterian Disaster Assistance National Response Team. He currently heads the Safety and Security Team for PDA, which trains congregations on preparing for and mitigating casualties from armed intruder attacks. During his 14-year tenure with the NRT, the National Response Team, Ron has been on the ground providing assistance to members, or to victims, I should say, of floods in Michigan, hurricanes in Florida and North Carolina, a mass shooting in Arizona, and the wildfires on Maui. In his previous life, Ron was a crisis management consultant for companies in the food industry. Ron's goal for tonight is to offer greater awareness and appreciation of the various disaster ministries that PDA performs. In his own words, Ron says, "I just want my Cornerstones colleagues to have a better understanding of this gem the next time a massive hurricane, tornado, wildfire, or flood strikes the United States." So, with that, Ron, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Nancy, and thank you, folks, for coming out tonight. Very happy to be with you and bring you a little information about a ministry that we have in our denomination that you may not know a lot about, and hopefully by the end of this evening you'll know more and we'll feel good about supporting it when the opportunity presents itself. Oftentimes when I'm being deployed on a disaster assignment, Polly will be asked by our friends like Larry and Allison in coffee hour, "Well, where's Ron this week?" And so I'm going to answer that by showing you where I've been the past couple of weekends, actually. Let's see here. If we can get this to work.
Oh, there you go. This is the right arrow button.
Just this?
Yes.
Okay, all right. Thanks. Okay, so 2 weeks ago, I was in the Texas Hill Country at Mo Ranch Presbyterian Conference Center. And this is where PDA was having its annual conference. It's a beautiful spot. It's actually near the LBJ Ranch. And it's open to visitors. So if you are ever down in that part of Texas and you want to see one of the nicest conference centers that we have in our church, I heartily recommend it. Last weekend, I was in Denver at Central Presbyterian Church. Now, Central is Denver's approximation to Fourth. It's located in downtown Denver, a couple of blocks from the state capitol, and it was built in 1892 by the same architect as the Brown Palace Hotel. If you know anything in Denver, you may have heard of the Brown Palace, made famous by the unsinkable Molly Brown, known for surviving the Titanic, and then, of course, made famous on Broadway by Debbie Reynolds, I think. So anyway, Central has a capacity of 1,200. It's the home of the Denver Philharmonic Orchestra. So imagine having, the Philharmonic play in your church. It has the largest narthex I've ever seen in any church. It's like Gratz lobby here. I mean, the center. I mean, that is their narthex. In fact, we had our training, the meeting for Denver Presbytery that we were there for. We had it in the church's narthex. Imagine trying to hold a meeting in our narthex. It's kind of amazing. For years at Fourth, I would sit there in the pews, and after a horrific disaster, I would hear one of Pastor Nanette's predecessors say before the offertory that any contributions could be designated to Presbyterian disaster assistance. And I had no idea what PDA was or what it did. Was it someone in Louisville who wrote checks? I wasn't sure. So before I tell you how I joined PDA, let me give you a little biographical history. Polly and I joined Fourth in 1992, 1 month apart. Many of you know Polly in her role as co-chair of the Adult Education Council, or maybe you served with her on session or deacons. Soon after we joined in 1992, we found ourselves serving together on a new member assimilation committee that was then headed by Associate Pastor Dave Donovan. Flash forward 8 years when we were both serving on the deacon board and our friendship and romance began. I know, I kick myself for not asking her to lunch after church years earlier. My mistake. We were married in 2002 by Parish Associate John Boyle in Blair Chapel on what is probably right about here. This was probably where Blair Chapel existed. Those of you who remember John know that we got a really good wedding prayer. In 2009, we vacationed in Santa Fe and attended worship at First Presbyterian in Santa Fe. And shortly before the service began, in walked about 50 people wearing blue jackets or blue shirts, and it was the National Response Team for Presbyterian Disaster Assistance. And they were holding their annual conference at nearby Ghost Ranch Conference Center. And one of them gave a minute for mission, and then after the church service, we chatted a few minutes with some of the PDA members. And the next day, we drove to Ghost Ranch, which we had expected to go to anyway, but I felt a little bit like a stalker. I didn't crash any of PDA's meetings, but we did have some conversations with them in between sessions. And the one thing that struck me is, these are really nice people. At that time, I was nearing retirement from my career as a crisis management consultant, and I had been planning to spend my retirement years as a Red Cross volunteer, another type of crisis management. But I thought, why not be a disaster volunteer for my own church? A lot less red tape and bureaucracy, and I just think I would enjoy it much more. And so that's what I did. I did some research and applied to join the National Response Team. And Adam Franzak, who was an associate pastor at Fourth at the time, wrote a letter of recommendation to PDA. And after a week of discernment and orientation at Ferncliff Conference Center in Arkansas, I was commissioned to PDA in March of 2010. I conducted a training at Adam's Church in Cincinnati, which is John Knox Presbyterian Church. Conducted a training there last October and gratefully thanked Adam for that recommendation that led to 14 years of memorable experiences. Adam told me last fall that the biggest change in his life since leaving Fourth is that he is now the father of 4 boys. 2 who came to the family with his wife, and they have 2 of their own. So he's a parent of 4 boys, and I couldn't resist grabbing this shot from the website for Knox Presbyterian of Adam getting a pie in the face to sort of symbolize his new parenthood responsibilities. This shows the geographic distribution of the 78 members of the National Response Team. You'll note the heavy concentration along the East Coast and the Gulf Coast primarily because of hurricanes. A lot of the people who are on the National Response Team were recipients of aid from PDA when they were actually survivors of hurricanes. So now they're in a position where they can give back and become a part of the disaster response group itself. Until last year, I was the only one on the National Response Team from Illinois. But Reverend Kristen Hudson moved from Iowa to Chicago last year and became pastor of Edgewater Presbyterian Church. So we now have 2 NRT members in Illinois. We're a diverse group, evenly divided between clergy and laity, and with a wide range of skills and backgrounds, including counseling, teaching, business, and even law enforcement. We're all volunteers who agreed to being deployed 4 weeks a year. That is what our commitment is. For some people, it may be a little more than that. For others, maybe not as much, depending on where the needs are. Most of the clergy members get approval from their sessions to deploy as their church's contribution to PDA. We update availability charts so that Jim Kirk, our leader at PCUSA headquarters in Louisville, knows who's available to be deployed when disaster strikes. For those of you who are familiar with our church hierarchy, PDA falls under the Presbyterian Mission Agency. The church pays for our travel expenses, but we receive no compensation, making PDA arguably the most cost-effective ministry in PCUSA. These 78 people on the National Response Team have become my second church. Through shared experiences in working with survivors and conditions, and occasionally staying on cots in church basements without electricity or Wi-Fi, there's a camaraderie that develops in that kind of shared experience. We receive regular updates, noting the joys and concerns in each other's lives, and so that we can keep in touch with each other and provide the prayers and words of support that are so meaningful. PDA is funded by the One Great Hour of Sharing, a special offering during Lent. I'm sure you've heard the appeals over the last few weeks. We are one of 3 PCUSA ministries funded by One Great Hour of Sharing. And as the denomination and the churches have lost membership over the last few years, you can understand that the giving to One Great Hour of Sharing has declined also. Thankfully, direct donations by individuals have helped make up for that shortfall. You should know that PDA doesn't just show up after a disaster. We only deploy at the invitation of a presbytery, and if it's felt that we can help with an identified need. Some of our counterparts in other denominations, disaster response organizations, are surprised by this. You really have to be invited in? We just watch the news and get in our trucks and go. No, we have to be invited in by the presbytery. And Reverend Jim Kirk, who leads our National Response Team, closely monitors all the weather news and disaster-related news, and often calls the executive presbyter in the affected area to ask whether he or she would like assistance, and oftentimes, in fact, most times, the answer is yes. We try to provide a ministry of presence on that first Sunday after a disaster. We want to be there at that church service in order to show that the denomination is behind you during your hour of need, and we're going to be with you through the recovery as well. A lot of times that's not possible to be there on that first Sunday because things may be so damaged in terms of your ability to even get to the disaster site that you're going to have to delay that first visit with the affected survivors. You'll also be glad to know that when volunteer relief organizations like PDA show up after a disaster, there's not a lot of overlap of services. Through years of planning and coordination with FEMA and associations like the voluntary organizations active in disaster, VOADs, we all know our roles. We're not trying to replicate the Red Crosses or Salvation Army's sheltering and feeding of survivors. Baptists show up with their chainsaws and shovels, and Methodists specialize in case management, trying to figure out who needs help the most. Mennonites bring their tools and carpentry skills. Adventists specialize in unsolicited donations, managing the warehouses of used clothing, toys, furniture, etc., that people inadvisably ship into a disaster zone, thereby creating a disaster within the disaster. They're well-meaning, but they have no idea what that can do if you're on the receiving end of these unsolicited donations. So thankfully, the Adventists have said, that's our job, we'll take care of that. Presbyterian disaster assistance plays more than one role. What we're best known for is long-term recovery. Being there long after the TV cameras have gone on to the next disaster. Helping a church or a presbytery become part of a community's long-term recovery group that raises money and resources for the rebuilding that will probably take years. Another PDA specialty is hosting, and that entails identifying churches near the disaster zone that will agree to host volunteer work teams that may come in from outside the area. A lot of churches, send youth groups or adults who have maybe some carpentry skills, or depending on whatever their support is, but they need a place to stay once they get there. So we identify the host churches, we train the churches in how to be hosts, and we also have a phone network, a call system set up so that we can match up people who want to come into the area for support and churches that are willing to host them when they arrive. Another specialty area for PDA is emotional and spiritual care. Not just for survivors, but also for disaster recovery workers and local churches who may have spent months immersed in recovery process and are experiencing burnout or compassion fatigue. We send counselors, teams in to conduct these workshops in order to help reinvigorate the folks there on the ground. We do respond to international disasters, but one of the information sheets that I provided sort of lists which countries we have provided assistance to. We don't send people in the U.S. outside. It's just not cost effective. We don't know the languages. We don't know a lot of the customs. So what we try to do is partner with reputable relief organizations that are on the ground locally. And we provide some financial support, maybe some people who are actually fluent in the language and can provide some guidance, but we're not sending people from our national response team to foreign countries. Now, Puerto Rico was an exception a few years ago with Hurricane Maria because a number of our people are Spanish speaking, and we're able to make that transition very well. Those experiences, I should say that the next area that I want to highlight is human-caused disasters. And PDA has been responding to human-caused disasters going back to the Oklahoma City bombing. But Columbine was the first mass shooting that we responded to, and that was 25 years ago last month. Since then, of course, there have been hundreds and hundreds of mass shootings, and we don't send teams to all of them. We only respond to mass shootings if the presbytery feels that a church or a community has been so impacted by this tragedy that they need counselors to come in and provide some trauma counseling. But that actually ends up being quite a few deployments for our human-caused disasters team. Out of all of that experience in responding to human-caused disasters came a book that 3 of our team members wrote. The title of the book is Recovering from Unnatural Disasters, a guide for pastors and congregations after violence and trauma. And one of the incidents in the book actually has a local tie, and that is the tragedy that occurred in 2009 at First Presbyterian Church in Wilmette. You may remember that the husband of the church's secretary shot her and their 17-year-old son in the church's manse and then took his own life. The pastor at First Wilmette then was Sarah Sarche Butter, who had been an associate pastor at Fourth just a couple of years earlier. Reverend Kate Wiebe was an associate pastor at First Presbyterian Wilmette at the time, and she was so appreciative of the counseling that she received and that our PDA response team was able to help provide some of the parishioners at First Wilmette, that she joined PDA the next year. Actually, it was the same year that I joined PDA. Kate has moved with her pastor husband to San Gabriel, California, but she has refocused her ministry on trauma counseling after incidents of violence. 2 weeks ago at our annual conference at Moe Ranch, one of the speakers was Reverend Gina Norris Lane, pastor of First Presbyterian Church in Uvalde, Texas. And you will remember that 19 students and 2 teachers were killed at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde. One was a girl whose family are members of First Presbyterian in Uvalde. But every person in that community of 15,000 was impacted, as were most of us across the nation, just watching that unfold. Reverend Norris Lane talked about the counseling she and others in the church received from the PDA team that was deployed and how invaluable it had been. And in fact, it wasn't just one deployment, it was multiple deployments. She also recommended that pastors should read Recovery from Unnatural Disasters because they and their congregants will very likely be impacted by violence in their community someday. After nearly 2 decades of responding to human-caused disasters, a turning point for PDA was the horrific 2017 shooting at First Baptist Church in Sutherland Springs, Texas, when 26 people were killed and another 22 injured. This is the interior of what was the church. It is now a memorial to those 26 victims, with a chair and red rose marking the spot where they were that morning. That caused a lot of churches within PCUSA to say to PDA, you know, it's great that you respond to these disasters, but how can you help us prepare for the possibility that we might find ourselves in this kind of a situation ourselves? So I was tasked, probably because I had worked with some food restaurant chains that had experienced some mass shootings. Anyway, I got tasked with the job of putting together a resource sheet so that our churches could become better informed about how to prepare for these kinds of tragic events. That resource sheet has been updated a number of times as new resources become available, and so we keep updating it. You have a copy of that tonight. I recommend that you take it home because there are a couple of places in there where you can educate yourself just by going online and taking a 1-hour free webinar that will make you better informed on self-survival techniques in the event you may need them someday, not necessarily for our church, but for any place you might be where these kinds of tragic events occur, whether it's a baseball stadium, like Sox Park last year, or theaters, or any kind of venue where a tragic event could occur. You need to know, you need to have a plan for what to do in the event you find yourself in that kind of situation. And that resource guide will help you become better informed. There's also resources on the PDA website as well. So I urge you to check that out. It's especially geared to pastors and congregations all kinds of videos, training videos, for pastors caring for traumatized individuals. It's a real library of resources right there on the PDA website. In 2019, I attended a New York State faith-based organization security conference, and I was the only Christian at the table that I was seated at. And as we went around the table, the Jewish representatives described the swastikas that were being spray painted on their synagogues. And the Muslims talked about the vandalizing of their mosques. And in 2019, I was hard pressed to think of any examples of any PCUSA churches that had been similarly targeted. But that soon changed in the summer of 2020. Since then, many PCUSA churches have been vandalized in various ways by members of hate groups who oppose certain of our social justice ministries. Last month, you heard about the possibilities of white Christian nationalism and the negative things that could result from that. We are already experiencing that. Many of our churches are experiencing that kind of hatred because of their dislike for certain ministries that we espouse. One of the worst things that happened in 2020, as an example of this, was the arson attack on Martin Luther King Presbyterian Church in Springfield, Massachusetts, which is the home church of 2 members of PDA's National Response Team. So this really hit close to home when 2 of your own church within a church members find their church being nearly destroyed by an arson attack that was later determined to be a hate crime. So we then developed not just the resource sheet, but we developed a training course that we could take out to presbyteries, and churches could send representatives to be trained. It's a full day training. And this photo shows me with 2 of my original trainers. Suzanne Malloy, well, both Suzanne Malloy and John Cheek are ordained Presbyterian pastors. But before they became pastors, they spent careers Suzanne in the Santa Barbara Police Department and John in the Tucson Police Department. So here are 2 former policemen, now ordained pastors, who bring this blend of knowledge to the trainings that we are presenting. And this team has now expanded to 10 people. We also have on the team now a retired career officer in the Department of Homeland Security who lives in South Carolina. We also have someone in Albany, New York, again, an ordained Presbyterian pastor whose full-time job now is working for the New York State Department of Homeland Security in teaching the risk assessment, teaching county officials how to assess threats that organizations and churches and individuals are receiving from people who might be thinking about an attack. So we've got a really broad range of experience on our training team. I'm not going to go through all of the agenda items in our training, but essentially it's, giving people the probability of an attack on an individual church. It's small, folks. It is very small. It's minuscule that, 9,000 churches in our denomination, and, you could count the number that have actually experienced an armed attack probably on one hand. So that kind of risk is small, but the other kind of risk that we're seeing now, more the vandalism kind of risk, and that kind of experience is far more common. We take people around the church, we educate them on various ways to make your church more secure. We also teach a course on Stop the Bleed. How can you, in the event there is an attack, how can you keep people alive until, using tourniquets until the response team arrives, the trauma group arrives with the ambulances. Interestingly, Stop the Bleed came into being after Sandy Hook. So that tells you that a number of those children might have lived if they had gotten treatment much sooner from response workers. One of the people who responded to Sandy Hook told me that the ambulances could not even get to the school because parents had immediately flocked to the school in order to see about their children, and so traffic was completely blocked, and the emergency vehicles were not able to get to the school as soon as they needed to. So, that's one of the sad realities. But anyway, that's one of the things that we do teach, or at least make people aware of in our training. The methodology that we use for violent intruder situations was developed by Alice Training Institute, which was created by a tactical law enforcement officer in Ohio and his school principal wife. So it's a train the trainers approach. And right now it has become probably the biggest trainer of school districts throughout the country. So, the school resource officers who are assigned to various schools will go to Alice, they'll get trained on this active shooter training, and then they'll go back and they'll teach within their schools. When I took the Alice course, I was the only representative from a faith-based organization. Everybody else was younger, and they were in law enforcement. They were school resource officers for the schools where they worked. And I thought, I can see that this would work in colleges, universities, high schools where there were, physically fit people, and even in workplaces where people are younger and better in better fit condition. But I wasn't sure it would work in a church where the demographic skews older. But I'm happy to say that it can. These self-survival techniques can work, and they can work with people our age. And I'm going to show you or talk to you about a couple of examples and show you a couple. These are 4 instances where active shooter attacks or active intruder attacks were halted by seniors. One was in Tucson, Arizona, in a supermarket parking lot. Representative Gabrielle Gifford was meeting with her constituents when a man with an automatic rifle began firing at people. And when he stopped to reload, Patricia Mesh, age 61, grabbed his arm and pulled him down and everyone within a 6-foot radius jumped on him and swarmed and held him down until the police quickly arrived. Another one took place in Cleveland Heights, Ohio, at Fairmount Presbyterian Church. This church, by the way, was pastored at one time by Kent Organ, Vicki Curtis's late husband. But this happened on a Wednesday night, not on a Sunday, but on a Wednesday night when children were being dropped off for choir practice. A well-dressed middle-aged woman who lived in the neighborhood walked into the church's fellowship hall and began stabbing a 19-year-old babysitter and driver for a family. The woman was not a member, but she looked like she belonged. The church's female director of education, who was in her late 50s at the time, had just received Alice training a month earlier by a Cleveland policeman. She bravely tackled the assailant and disarmed her. The only man in the entire fellowship hall ran over and helped hold the attacker down until the police arrived. Now, fortunately, the 19-year-old babysitter was not seriously wounded. The reason for the attack? She was wearing fake fur boots, and the attacker was a PETA zealot. On May 15th, 2022, an attack took place at Geneva Presbyterian Church in Laguna Woods, California. The occasion was a lunch in honor of the former pastor of Irvine Taiwanese Presbyterian Church, which shared the church on Sundays.
Another mass shooting in America over the weekend, this time at a church in California. One person was killed, 5 others were wounded, and the FBI tonight now revealing it is investigating this shooting as a hate crime as well. Tonight, we hear from the pastor. He describes how he and the parishioners took down the 68-year-old suspect and tied him up. ABC's chief national correspondent Matt Gutman on the scene in Laguna Woods, California tonight.
Tonight, police say 68-year-old David Chow walked into the Southern California church bearing 2 handguns and a political grudge.
It is believed the suspect involved was upset about political tensions between China and Taiwan.
Police say the suspect is an immigrant from China who drove 4 hours from Las Vegas to target this Taiwanese congregation. About 50 congregants had gathered for a luncheon for former pastor Billy Chang. Police say Chow, a licensed security guard, came in with a gun, even trying to trap them inside.
Multiple locations had been chained shut, and multiple entrances that we had been tampered with.
He then opened fire, injuring 5. They ranged in age from 66 to 92, and one man was killed, Dr. John Chang.
Dr. Chang charged the individual, the suspect, attempted to disarm him.
It was then that Pastor Chang saw an opportunity.
I bring a chair to attack the shooter.
So you hit the shooter with a chair?
Yes.
This image showing the moment Pastor Chang and others managed to subdue the shooter. Those elderly congregants tied him up with electrical cord.
David, the FBI says it has multiple pieces of evidence, including writings indicating this was a hate crime, and if the suspect is convicted just on those state charges alone of murder and attempted murder, he could face the death penalty. David. All right, Matt Gutman, our thanks to you as well.
I happened to talk to the pastor of Geneva Presbyterian after that happened at the training we did at the presbytery. You can imagine, if you have an incident like that in your presbytery, you want to do a training, you know, because it becomes so real. And so we did a training at Los Ranchos Presbytery last year, and I got to talk to the pastors because it's really 2 churches. It's the Taiwanese church that shares space with Geneva Presbyterian, but you can imagine the host church was as impacted as if they had been targets themselves. But the Taiwanese Presbyterians did a book on this incident, each writing about their experience. I saw, it's in Taiwanese, so of course, I couldn't read it, but the illustrations and their firsthand accounts, it's just amazing. One 90-year-old who was in a wheelchair, the shooter tripped over the platform of the wheelchair where his feet were. And the 90-year-old man thought this was, his way of stopping the shooter. This was God helping him, bring some peace to the incident. And so it was very touching to meet them and hear some of their firsthand accounts. The last example of seniors being able to interrupt this kind of incident took place in Alabama, in Vestavia Hills, Alabama, in an Episcopal church, and at a gathering very much like this.
Deadly shooting at an Alabama church, a gunman opening fire at a potluck dinner, fatally killing 2 people. We learned a 3rd person has now died as well. Police called to the scene of an active shooter, a hero inside the church, pinning the gunman down until authorities arrived. The Stevens Episcopal Church, the latest safe space, then struck by gun violence. Tonight, the suspect, a 70-year-old man who had been seen at the church before, has now been charged. ABC's Elwin Lopez is on the scene in Alabama.
Tonight, authorities charging a 70-year-old man with capital murder, accused of killing 3 people inside an Alabama church.
A active shooter situation, multiple patients at this time.
Late today, officials say Robert Finlay Smith, seen here in this newly released mugshot with a black eye, opened fire at St. Stephen's Episcopal Church during the potluck dinner on Thursday.
He produced a handgun and began shooting, striking 3 victims.
The founder of that church saying his wife spotted the suspect there more than once.
My wife says that he looked like he didn't take very good care of himself, and he had a hard time communicating with people.
Police crediting another attendee with stopping the shooting, taking the gunman down and pinning him until officers arrived.
It was extremely critical in saving lives. The person that subdued the suspect, in my opinion, is a hero.
Officials identifying the victims as 84-year-old Jane Pounds, 75-year-old Sarah Yeager, and 84-year-old Walter Bargraney.
One of the kindest people you can imagine. If you wanted to pick out somebody that just you love being with, it would be Bart Rainey.
And David, police say they believe the gunman acted alone and there are currently no threats to the community. And tonight, officials have not released a motive. And David, I spoke to the founder of this church just a few moments ago, and he says that this will become a place of peace once again. David?
Elwin Lopez in Alabama. Elwin, thank you.
So I want to wrap up my comments tonight by highlighting some recommendations. And that is, whenever you're in a meeting room or a restaurant, a theater, a concert hall, an athletic arena, a political rally, a different church, or even our own church, look around and plan an exit strategy in case you have to quickly evacuate. We should all do this routinely. When we go someplace we've never been, look around, think, if I need to get out of here quickly, what's the best way for me to do that? If at all possible, evacuate an area where there is a threat. Evacuation is 90% of survival. It may feel like you just want to duck under the table you're under. If you can make it out, your chances of survival are actually better. So again, evacuation is 90% of survival. Become informed. Don't rely on staff or ushers or others to come to your aid. These situations are chaotic. The resource sheets that you have tonight have a number of free trainings available on them. There is one from Church Mutual Insurance. I urge you to check that one out. It's a 1-hour video, but you can watch it and get a lot of the information that you could get from an ALICE training course. And by the way, I understand that at least the staff and some of the key employees here at Fourth has received online ALICE training. So you may be interested in knowing that. And then lastly, I would like to ask that the next time there is a disaster that is just dominating the news, whether it's a natural disaster like a hurricane or a nearby tornado or a flood or a mass shooting in a school, and you're asking, what can I do to help those people? What I would like for you to do and ask is that you go to the PDA website. There is a donation link on the website, and make a small donation to help the cause, because that money can be identified for that particular disaster, and you will be helping with the disaster through your own church. So that wraps it up, and I will be happy to take any questions you might have. Bobby.
What have the churches done to make changes since your training?
The most important thing that any church can do, and the number one reason we do the trainings in the first place, is to motivate them to create, if it doesn't already exist, a safety and security team or advisory board, whatever they want to call it, but they need to have identified, depending on the size of the church, anywhere from, a half a dozen to 10 people from varied types of expertise who have a motivation towards security, safety and security, and are willing to serve on that committee. And maybe even if they're motivated, even lead it. And most importantly, create a safety and security plan for the church. And then once that happens, then they can share it with the congregants. But they need to start that and build that plan themselves before they can say, here's what we would do in the event of a tornado, in the event of a fire, in the event of an armed intruder. They need to figure that out. And there are resources available to these churches in order to help them do that planning. But that's the most important thing.
As a follow-up then, do you know if our church has a safety plan in place?
I have met a couple of times with the director of administrative services, and I know that, and she is in charge of security. So I know that there has been a lot of careful thought into safety and security. Maybe you could speak to that, Nanette.
Yeah. As one of the clergy, I've been through the online ALICE training. All of us have. A lot of the staff has been through the ALICE training. And we do have a little team working on it. We've been planning and preparing for fire, and we've been doing fire drills. We have a little evacuation during emergencies that might happen during worship. We have sort of some plans for that. So we're working on it and trying to get better at it and thinking about different scenarios that might happen. So definitely working on it.
The church that I was at last week in Denver, Central Presbyterian, has a safety and security committee that is led by a career professional in school safety. In fact, he was in charge of school safety for the Denver Public Schools for 20 years. So imagine having somebody in your church who is a safety professional. So he was the obvious choice to lead that committee within Central Presbyterian. And what he was able to do was to get some people around him to put together the plan. And importantly, he also applied for a national FEMA security grant that is available to houses of worship. Believe me, synagogues they know how to do this. And most of the faith-based organizations that receive FEMA grants are synagogues, because they can document that they have already been on the receiving end of these kinds of threats. And so they sort of move to the top of the hierarchy in terms of consideration when these grants are awarded. But Central Presbyterian in Denver was able to get a security grant for, I think it was $175,000. You have to specify what you're going to use that grant money for. But they were able to put on all new locks. They put in shatterproof glass in windows. They put in new glass for their nursery, all kinds of things to make their church more secure and safe. And so it was really kind of a motivator to have the training there and for people to see, wow, this is how it could be. Maybe we could get some of this if we applied ourselves. So that was a good place to have the training, because we were able to see firsthand what a leadership church had done. Any other questions?
One quick one. So for the regular response teams, how many are on a response team, and how long is, say, you talk about multiple deployments, but is there an average length for a deployment say some kind of event, non-human triggered event, but
Yeah,
more
I would say the average number of people per deployment is 2 to 3. And, it's really rare when somebody is sent out solo. You need to have somebody there who you can kind of confer with and exchange ideas about, how do we approach this? And so, we generally try to, if possible, send a team out that may have a pastor and a lay person. There may be a need, depending on where the disaster occurs, for diversity on that team. So it depends on where it occurs and what type of disaster it is. But 2 to 3 people is usually the norm. The worst deployment in my 14 years was being deployed solo after Hurricane Irma in Florida in 2017, I think. I was asked to go to Orlando to embed with FEMA. This was 6 months after the tornado. FEMA had set up a disaster response headquarters in Orlando with 1,200 FEMA employees that they took over a vacated AT&T building, 6 stories, so 1,200 people are scattered in these 6 floors, each doing their own thing. And my job was to go around to various counties with FEMA, they call them volunteer agency liaisons, to help set up long-term recovery groups that had not yet been formed. And by the 6-month mark, everybody was so exasperated with FEMA because the amount of money received was not enough. It came too late, and there was too much involved in the application process. And so I was kind of the buffer to set up the meetings, because they might respond to somebody from Presbyterian Disaster Assistance more than they would somebody from FEMA. But being kind of isolated like that, because at night there was, the FEMA folks, they were so exhausted by this time, they did not want to, share my company. And so it was a solo, deployment for a better part of a month. And fortunately, we have care buddy teams. And so I got calls during that month from a couple of people who raised their hand and said, I'll give Ron a call occasionally and see how he's doing. But that was welcomed, because otherwise, you're there kind of in a solo situation. So having a team really makes it a far better situation. And I just spilled my water. Sorry about that.
Ron,
Yes.
can you tell us again what ALICE means? What
ALICE
the most
is,
important
yes,
thing
ALICE is an acronym. And it is patterned after the Department of Homeland Security Run, Hide, Fight. You've probably heard of Run, Hide, Fight. ALICE is another options-based approach to active shooters, but they've extended it. Instead of 3 letters, it's 5. And the A is for alert. When do you first hear of the disaster? L is lockdown, in case you have to, try to avoid the shooter until the police arrive. Where can you do that safely? I is inform. How do you report the incident? C is counter, not fight, but counter. Doing that mostly through distraction and disruption, not hand-to-hand combat. And then E is evacuate, maybe the most important letter in the entire acronym. In terms of disruption or distraction, one of the things I'm very proud of that I invented, I asked people, what if you had a 2-pound brick that you could have at your, within arm's reach in the event you needed it? Well, yeah, if I had a 2-pound brick, that's better than not having anything in the case of, an armed intruder. Well, we all have 2-pound bricks in the form of the Presbyterian hymnal, which weighs 2 pounds, 2 ounces. It's within arm's reach. And if you throw it like a Frisbee, not like a shot put, because it's just going to land at the feet of the individual. But if you throw it like a Frisbee, and I practice this a lot, I've gotten very good at it, in fact, you get aerodynamics with the spin like a Frisbee. If you throw it head high, the shooter has to duck. And when he ducks, he lowers the weapon in the course of doing that. And we show people in the training what to do when that happens. Like the lady at the Gabby Gifford incident, it can be done. And it can be done by somebody our age. Thank you, and I'm sorry that I spilled my water.
Ron, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. You're sharing your experiences and your wisdom. So thank you for being here. And I know that, yes, let's have a nice hand. And I know that Gunn has a few words to say and announcements for next month.
Well, Ron, thank you very much for an important, very informative talk. And we certainly need to keep it in our hearts and by our hearts. So if anything happens around here, we are prepared. I just want to let you announce our next meeting will be on June 7th. And we are going to meet with Reverend R. and have an interaction, talk with him. That's, I think, how he is planning to do. And hopefully we'll see you all then on the June 7th. And after that, Nancy Thompson is going to take over the leadership of this organization. So thank you for coming.